Hey, what's up, guys? Thank you so much for joining me today for our Unraveling ADHD webinar. It's really fun to do these topic-specific ones because it allows us to really dive deep into one subject, which today will be ADHD instead of having such a broad topic. But with that, I'm just glad that you guys are here with me today. And I'm Steven Stinn. A little bit about me, so you know. I did my schooling at Creighton, Iowa State, and Palmer. I'm a pediatric and family chiropractor, and I like to focus on neurodevelopmental disorders such as ADHD, as well as things like autism and OCD and Tourette's and dyslexia and learning and behavior issues and things like that. In my free time, I love watching sports, huge Iowa State and Indiana Green Bay fan. But the thing that makes our office a little bit different when we're taking care of, a child with ADHD or whatever, is that we have a salutogenic approach. And salutogenesis literally means creation of health in Latin. So it's an approach focusing on factors that support human health and well-being rather than factors that cause disease. So what that means is we actually focus on whether, like I said, one kid comes in with ADHD, the next one has back pain, the next one has behavior issues, whatever it is. We focus on trying to add health to that person rather than combating whatever disorder or disease they have. So we know that when people become healthy, they tend to not have those symptoms that they came in with. So instead of focusing on whatever disease or disorder they have, we say, how do we add health to this person? And that's kind of what it means to be like a salutogenic office. But I'm a huge bookworm, so I read all the time, books, journals. I also watch webinars, really any kind of information I can get my hand on neurodevelopmental disorders. So that's kind of what I made this presentation from. So it's going to feel kind of like you're drinking from a fire hose of information. For that reason, I actually made an email series. So I think I have all your emails. If I don't, just message me and I'll get you on it. But it's just a nice supplement of information of what we're going over tonight, as well as stuff that we don't have time to get to tonight because it's such a broad topic. You'll be getting those emails, to kind of supplement what you learned tonight. So if you don't want them, just feel free to unsubscribe. I don't want to bother you, but I figured if you signed up for the webinar, you would probably like that email series as well, so you can be looking for that. But yeah, just know that this presentation is made from, legit sources. It's not like I'm just spouting off my opinions here all night. But with that, so the three questions that we're trying to answer tonight is what's going on? Like, why is this ADHD kind of epidemic happening, and what's next? So what are some actual tools that, we can teach you tonight to where you can actually start applying them to your children, tonight or tomorrow or whenever, to actually benefit them and start increasing their quality of life and everything like that. Just a really quick stat, about 11% of kids have been diagnosed with ADHD. So that was as of 2011. So my guess is that it's just gone up from there. But conservatively, about 11% of kids diagnosed with ADHD, and 1 in 8 have an anxiety disorder. And the reason I also put the anxiety disorder stat here is because a lot of kids that have ADHD also have anxiety. And by the end of tonight, you'll probably be able to link why that is. And, 1 in 8 have an anxiety disorder. Most kids with ADHD, they have multiple diagnoses. It's usually not just ADHD. Usually it's ADHD anxiety or ADHD and a GI system problem or ADHD and something else. And usually they have like 2 or 3 different tags and not just one alone. And this is really the stat that kind of, smacked me in the face, was that 43% of kids have a chronic health condition. And that just blew me away, because usually I thought of chronic health conditions as something old people had, right? Like that's just something that eventually with age that, you might get. But this is 43% of kids have a chronic health condition, and it's not something that we're really talking about, like on the nightly news, or it's not just a topic, a common topic that you're talking with to your friends. So I just love sharing this information and kind of explaining that there is a problem and there's a better way to go about things than what we're currently doing. So the most important thing is I want to be able to give you guys a roadmap tonight, because a lot of the times you get this diagnosis of ADHD and then you just are kind of left in the dark, and there's no really like, what's my next step? Like, what should I do? Should I be doing it? How do I help, get rid of this, or how do I help navigate through this? And that's kind of my objective tonight is to help you, get through this and find that roadmap to what's my next step. So really the question that we're asking tonight is, are you getting to the root cause, or are you just managing the problem of your ADHD? With traditional chiropractic, in the area, that's what most chiropractors are, of the traditional variety. And I always say, what do you typically think of when you think of a chiropractor? And usually it's like bone cracking or neck pain or back pain or like a muscle spasm or something like that. And most chiropractors do a great job at that. And that's kind of what the traditional chiropractic does. But at Restore Chiropractic, we focus more on nerve system correction. So, I'm going to be saying nerve system a ton tonight. So I think it's important to kind of explain what nerve system means. And if you haven't guessed, I put the picture on the screen here. The nervous system is your brain, your brainstem, spinal cord. And the reason that that's so important is because that's what controls and coordinates everything in your body, right? It controls and coordinates all the other systems in your body. So if the brain and brainstem aren't working optimally, then nothing else in your body can work optimally. So that's why we really focus on making sure that that's working correctly. And then when that does, that gets back to our salutogenic approach. We're adding health to that person by optimizing their nerve system. But in order to appreciate kind of, an abnormal understanding what that is, we have to really know what normally happens, right? So we hear of ADHD a lot and other neurodevelopmental issues. And when we ask exactly what's going on in the brain of a child that has ADHD, if you've ever been asked that, that's a pretty tough question, right? Like, what's going on in the brain of a kid with ADHD? And it's like, I don't know. We know all the symptoms of what's going on, but we don't actually know why their brain is that way. And that's a tough question. But this is kind of going to shed some light on that. So the normal brain development, what just normally should happen in kids and humans, is you're born with these things called primitive reflexes. And the reflexes that you're born with, and they're there to, I call them the training wheels of the brain. They're there to help develop your brain and help you with survival for about the first 4 to 6 months of life. So your brain isn't developed enough when you're born. It's only like 25% developed, I think, when you're born. So you need these reflexes there to be able to give feedback to your brain of what to do. So when you are first born, there's a feeding reflex or a rooting reflex where they turn to feed. Or, if you turn their head this way, their arms will extend out and flex on the other side, and vice versa. It just kind of teaches them how to move their arms around. And then once they do this enough, and once they get enough feedback from these reflexes, then the brain can go, okay, I understand how to do this on my own. I don't need these reflexes anymore. And then it'll get rid of them. So they're a really good thing for that first 4 to 6 months, because they're providing so much feedback to the brain, because the brain's not sure how to function. So it's giving it this automatic input. So then the brain finally can go, oh, okay, I understand that now. So now I don't need these training wheels and I can get rid of them. But they literally grow the brain, and their repetitive automatic movements are essential for developing, balance, mobility, vision, hearing, speaking, learning, communication. Ideally, these primitive reflexes, they'll merge into more sophisticated movements and become integrated with the brain, but they need to be gone before more mature development can happen. So retained primitive reflexes means the whole brain will be delayed to some capacity if they're not gone. So that's what the brain can't keep maturing up if you still have these primitive reflexes. So what normally happens is they go away at 4 to 6 months because you don't need them anymore. And then you start developing the sensory motor system. And this is kind of your movement system, your muscles, your core musculature, things like that. And the reason that that's so important is because movement is what actually stimulates and builds the brain. So with no movement, if your child never moved, they wouldn't be able to develop their brain, because that's what the brain needs to be able to develop properly. So you can understand why having a proper sensory motor system would be essential to further developing the brain. So you start, developing these cross-crawl patterns, these different movement patterns. They start moving a lot. They start developing their core musculature. And then with all that movement and stimulation, that's what gives the brain input. And then you move up to cognitive development, which is kind of brain development. And then with proper input from the sensory motor system, the brain develops evenly from left to right, and there's not like this huge imbalance. And then when that happens, then you get to the top, which is instruction, which is, typical learning and behavior, able to sit still in class, able to critically think, able to behave properly in situations, things like that. So that's what normally happens. That's what should happen. And then I'll try to just quickly go through what kind of happens with a child that has ADHD, what happens during the pyramid. So they are born with primitive reflexes, just like the normal pyramid. But what happens is they don't get rid of them for some reason. They don't use them enough. They don't get enough movement. Maybe they don't stimulate those reflexes enough to where the brain doesn't feel comfortable letting them go. So their brain's always in this training wheels phase where they can never fully go to the next step because they're stuck here. And even though they're supposed to be gone at 6 months, whether you're 6 or 12 or 18 or 47 or it doesn't matter what age, a lot of people still hold on to their retained primitive reflexes. And the problem with that is you can't keep developing up this pyramid very well if you still have the primitive reflexes present. So like I said, they need to be gone before more mature development can happen. Retained primitive reflexes means the whole brain will be delayed to some capacity. If they're not gone by that 4 to 6 month range, it's the first major sign of a neurological issue. So that's why I check them on all these kids that come into the office, and you can check them at home. We'll kind of go through that. It's just really important that you check to see if your child has primitive reflexes, because almost every single kid with ADHD has retained primitive reflexes, and that means it's a developmental problem, and then it fits into this pyramid. But there's actually research on motor milestones and then subsequent development of the brain. So what that means is, you're looking at these kids, and if they missed a motor milestone, if they're not walking in time, or if they're walking way too early or something like that, and they're missing these motor milestones, there's actually evidence that causes subsequent development of the brain. So their brain's not going to develop up this pyramid the way that it should. And usually that's because they're missing their milestones, and they're not walking or crawling or whatever in time because they have a retained primitive reflex that should be gone. And then once they don't get rid of the sensory, or once they do not get rid of their primitive reflexes, then they're not able to build a proper sensory motor system. It's impossible to have a really strong core or be able to develop a proper sensory motor system if you still have retained primitive reflexes. And the reason that that's important is because that sensory motor system is what then feeds into cognitive and brain development. So if the sensory motor system's weak and you don't have enough input coming into your brain from your sensory motor system, well, then your brain's not going to be able to develop properly, and you're going to have weak networks here or there, and the brain's most likely not going to grow in unison from left to right. And with ADHD kids, usually it's really typical that their left brain's really strong and their right brain's a little weaker. And then when that happens, then the instruction isn't quite there. They can't sit still in class. They can't, really sit down and critically think on something, or they get distracted too easily or something like that. So that's typically kind of the trajectory an ADHD brain will take versus the normal brain. And this is the same pyramid. It's just much more broken down. And the thing that's important is that in our office, we take a bottom-up approach. In my opinion, ADHD is a developmental problem in nature. If a child struggles with, say, reading, just giving them more reading isn't going to make the problem better, right? And that's kind of a top-down approach, right? They're struggling with a certain subject or reading or whatever, and then they just give them more of that. And that's a top-down approach. That's not what's going to help in the long term. What you want to do is build this pyramid from the bottom up. If they're missing some gaps or holes in the foundation of the pyramid, that's where we're going to want to go back and fix those holes and get rid of the primitive reflexes if they still have them, and build up that sensory motor system. So then that can feed into the cognitive brain development. And then they're able to, at the top, have the proper academic learning and behavior. If the brain missed a step, it didn't get certain pathways as strong as they should, this will lead to problems sooner or later. We're going to be talking a ton about the cerebellum, and an underdeveloped cerebellum means you're going to have an underdeveloped vestibular and oculomotor system, which the vestibular system is that inner ear system that has to do with balance and also has to do with eye tracking, and then oculomotor is the eyes movement. So if you have these primitive reflexes, your vestibular system is going to be off. That's going to make your eyes not be able to track properly. If your eyes can't track properly, you're not going to be able to read properly if they're constantly, overshooting or undershooting a line, or not able to follow the line in a smooth rhythm. These are all going to be things that affect their ability to read. And they also see that a lot of kids with ADHD, they physically cannot focus their eyes for more than like 3 seconds because these systems are so weak. So they're constantly like moving their eyes around, and you can imagine if you're trying to concentrate on a teacher in the front of the room, it's going to be almost impossible, right? If you're trying to concentrate on who's talking and your eyes are constantly moving to some other stimulus, you're not going to be able to concentrate for very long. So that's why taking this bottom-up approach is a really big deal for us. And primitive reflexes and a strong core, that has to happen before any long-term success can happen with results. So if these primitive reflexes down here are still there and the sensory motor system's weak, those two things need to be fixed before we can ever see any long-term progress with academic learning and behavior and at the top of the pyramid. So really the thing that we're talking about tonight is abnormal brain development and a nerve system imbalance can lead to ADHD or at least ADHD-like symptoms. And that's kind of the whole premise of tonight. And this is a little video of your nerve system. So you have your brain, your spinal cord, right here, the brainstem blinking right there. And just a real quick anatomy review. You got your meninges right here that wraps around your spinal cord. It holds the cerebrospinal fluid in there, and that's really what gives nutrition to the nerve system. And then here's just a nice little cross section of the spinal cord and what that looks like. And then they'll show that the nerve system is encased in bone. The spinal column is encased with your spine. Your spinal cord's encased with your spine. And really the only organs in your body that are encased in bone is your nerve system. Your skull and your spinal are your vertebral column. And the reason for that is because we know that the nerve system's so important, right? That's there for protective measurements. So that was just a really quick overview of the nerve system. Again, if you needed that, I'm going to take a drink here quick. But this is kind of the overall roadmap that we're going to be going over tonight. And what we're really going to be concentrating on is the cerebellum right here. And this is the cerebellum and brainstem area that I've highlighted. But the cerebellum and brainstem and how they're functioning is a huge factor in what we want to functionally measure in the office. So most kids with ADHD problems, they have a weak or at least an immature cerebellum. And you'll see here why that contributes to a lot of their challenges. The cerebellum has a huge component of controlling the motor system. So that was the second level of the pyramid. And the thing that you'll be able to see with a lot of kids with ADHD is they're really clumsy. They're not able to carry out complex movements. They kind of have, maybe they're not able to skip, or they are kind of uncoordinated. And the reason for that is that their cerebellum's weak, and that's in charge of motor movement. And cerebellum also contributes to controlling all other brain functions, especially cognitive and behavioral controls. So the cerebellum and how strong or weak that is going to be able to impact your cognitive development, your higher level learning, able to use your prefrontal cortex and things like that, as well as your behavior and how well you're able to manage that. Are you able to manage your emotions and not freak out to something that you shouldn't be? So that's in part due to the cerebellum and how strong or weak that is. And the cerebellum is also key to normal cognitive and emotional development of the brain, and it's a key player to learning anything, whether it's learning a new movement or cognitive learning or critical thinking. This all plays a part with the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is a huge factor on the overall function of the brain. And now that we know that a strong cerebellum is what's going to feed and develop the rest of the overall function of the brain, now I can kind of tell you why I went through the trouble of what the cerebellum is all in control of and all these different ADHD-like symptoms, because primitive reflexes are where the cerebellum is where primitive reflexes reside. So if your child still has these primitive reflexes, it's an automatic window in saying that the cerebellum is weak, because the cerebellum is still in this training wheel phase if they still have primitive reflexes, because that's where they reside. So if the cerebellum is weak, then all of those other things I just listed that the cerebellum controls are going to be weak. So because primitive reflexes reside at the cerebellum, if your child still has primitive reflexes, like I said, direct indicator that the cerebellum is still in the training wheel phase. And remember, the foundations of that pyramid is the primitive reflexes we're at the very bottom. So if there's weak areas or gaps, it'll undermine all the other levels of that brain pyramid. So that's why it's really important to check to see if these kids still have primitive reflexes, because that's an automatic indicator that the cerebellum's weak, and that means that the very bottom of the pyramid has some gaps in it that need to be filled. So we already know that the cerebellum's immature if you still have primitive reflexes, so the area of the brain that is a huge factor on overall function of the brain is weak if you still have primitive reflexes. So I think that you guys probably understand that now. So we'll get into what some of the different primitive reflexes are and what you can check with your child. This is just a study done by Dr. Robert Melillo. He's saying that primitive reflexes, if your child has them, it shows that they have a delayed brain maturation or maturity. There's underconnectivity or functional disconnect in these kids that have primitive reflexes, and that's when one side of the brain is much stronger than the other. Like I said, with ADHD, they really have a super strong left brain and a weak right brain, and then there's this functional disconnect where they can't communicate very well together. So ultimately, what primitive reflexes are there for is to give feedback to the brain, and then once you get rid of them, then you can start developing even higher levels of development and even higher levels of feedback to your brain. But the first reflex I will go over is the Moro Reflex. This is kind of a startle reflex. Kids that have this reflex typically are overreactive, hypersensitive, poor stamina, can't pay attention, anxious, moody. This really affects the whole emotional profile of a kid. So it's really important that if they have a Moro reflex, it's one of the hardest hitting reflexes in my opinion. Like I said, it affects the whole emotional profile. So if they have this, we really want to work on getting rid of that. And like I said, it's common with kids with hyperactivity, ADHD, behavioral issues. And like I said before, if these primitive reflexes you can be 60 or 70 or 80 years old and still have your retained primitive reflexes if you've never looked. So if retained into adulthood, if people have this Moro reflex, they'll kind of have this free-floating anxiety, can't shut off the mind. They're always going to be kind of on high alert and really have exaggerated responses to stimulus and things like that. And then the next one is a tonic labyrinthine reflex. This is closely linked to the Moro. They're both vestibular or balance in nature. So the TLR provides the baby with a means of learning about gravity and then mastering neck and head control after they're born. So this reflex gives the baby opportunity to practice balance, increase muscle tone, develop the proprioceptive and vestibular senses. But if it doesn't go away, it can result in kids being motion sick or car sick. They have poor posture, poor muscle tone, visual perception difficulties. They can have poor balance. They have oculomotor dysfunction, meaning their eyes can't track well. They don't converge or diverge, which means like if you're looking at your paper and then look up at the board, when you're looking down at your paper, your eyes converge, and then when you look up at the board, they diverge, and they don't do that well, so that affects with their attention. They have auditory problems, organizational problems. These are the kids that wrap their legs underneath their seat. If you know what I'm talking about, they'll wrap their legs underneath the front legs of the seat, and that's more of a balance issue. Like I said, that's what the tonic labyrinthine reflex will do if you still have it. So it's just something to look out for if your kid does that as well. The next reflex is a spinal gallant. So this helps the child with the birth process. This is if you check it, you kind of just brush the low back of your child on either side of the spine, and you'll kind of see that they wiggle around as if they're kind of getting tickled, and that's a spinal gallant reflex. And what it's there for is it helps the child through the birth process. So when they're going through the birth canal, it almost helps them worm out and assist the mom, and that's one of the reasons that the primitive reflex is there. But a child who fidgets in his or her chair and can't focus is much more likely suffering from this active primitive reflex. Once these reflexes are integrated, head and limb muscle groups can move independently, and the ability to sit attentively without fidgeting comes easily. And yeah, so if you have this, it'll affect posture, gait, which is kind of your movement pattern. It's how you walk or run or things like that. A lot of times these kids with this reflex will have a kind of an odd looking walk or run. Responsible for fidgeting, bedwetting, poor concentration, digestive issues. It's classically found in kids with ADHD-like symptoms. It's called the ants in the pants reflex. These kids can't sit still when they have a spinal gallant. So obviously really important to get rid of that reflex if they have it. And then the next one is an asymmetric tonic neck reflex. This also helps the birth process. It kind of provides an ability for the baby to corkscrew down the birth passage. This is one where if you turn your head this way, they'll extend out their arm and flex on the other side, and vice versa when they go. It kind of teaches them movement of their arm, so then they're able to do that later on. The ATNR also provides training in hand-eye coordination. If it remains active, it's one of the most significant causes of inability to function well in school. So it affects handwriting, expression of ideas in written form, eye tracking problems, difficulty crossing the midline. And what I mean by that is, for example, if your eyes are tracking when you're reading, when they get right here to the midline, they might jump up a line or jump down a line or refocus or blink and lose their spot, and they can't cross that midline very well. So every time their eyes cross that midline, it might do something funky, their eyes, so then they have a lot of trouble reading. Other long-term effects could include dyslexia, reading, listening, handwriting, spelling difficulties, poor sense of direction, confused handedness, focus, balance, difficulty reading, writing, self-care, sports, things like that. So this is probably one of the easiest ones to check on your child. They would just go on there and you can Google this, or actually I have a packet made with all these reflexes and kind of how to check for them. And obviously I do these normally in live and in person, and I give people the packet, but this is a webinar. So if you want that, just message me, or I'll try to remember to email you guys that packet so you're able to check all these on your kids. Otherwise, just Google it. There's a ton of information on all these reflexes. So, but if you wanted to check this, they would go on their hands and knees, and then you just turn their head both to the left and right. And when they turn their head to the right, their left elbow will be straight, and then it'll bend and kind of blow out when you turn their head to the right. And then when you turn their head to the left, their right elbow will blow out. And that's the asymmetric tonic neck reflex. So if your child does that, that means they have this reflex. And then there's a symmetric tonic neck reflex, affects posture, hand-eye coordination, slump while sitting in the desk. These are the kids that lie on their desk when they write. If you know what I mean, they'll really just put their whole chest on their desk when they're writing. That has to do with the biomechanics of having a symmetric tonic neck reflex. And then there's also oral hand and foot reflexes. These are like the palmar, the Babinski, things like that. When these reflexes remain active, we may see people moving their mouth or tongue when they're writing or drawing. These active foot reflexes, like the Babinski, interfere with our ability to walk and think and speak in a flowing rhythm. So a lot of times when kids miss their motor milestones of walking or whatever, it's because they still have a Babinski reflex that needs to go away. So yeah, it can affect all different things, speech delays, difficulties, things like that. So now that we're all masters on primitive reflexes, and like I said, if you want more information, just Google, Pinterest has great information on these all over. So just type in all those different reflexes and you'll get scads of information. But next up is, after we get rid of those primitive reflexes, then we want to build up that sensory motor system, and that's more your core musculature and things like that. But the majority of your subconscious stimulus to the brain comes from spinal, postural, and core muscles. So the majority of even it's subconscious, you don't know what's going on, but the majority of information going to your brain is from your muscles. So that's probably something you didn't know, and that's why it's so important that this sensory motor system and your muscular system has to be strong enough to give that feedback to your brain, or otherwise your brain's not going to be able to develop the way that it should. And the main reason someone doesn't get a strong core or a stable core or a stable sensory motor system is because they still have retained primitive reflexes. So once we get rid of those primitive reflexes, then we can start building up that sensory motor system. Muscle tone and movement literally drive brain activity. We kind of went over that. The cerebellum, thalamus, muscle tone has to change before long-term effect can happen in the brain. So because you wouldn't actually be changing the firing rate of the brain without increasing the sensory motor system. So nothing will last long-term, with these kids with results for ADHD unless you get rid of primitive reflexes and increase the motor system and core stability and things like that. So that's why the two bottom things of this pyramid are so important to get right, if you want long-lasting changes with your child with ADHD. So Then after that, the vestibular system and the cortical system and the brain systems and networks can work properly. And what this means is you need to make sure that you're taking that bottom-up approach and you're not trying to manage things top-down. But we went over primitive reflexes. That was kind of the first one. If you still had primitive reflexes, it's an automatic indicator that that cerebellum's weak, because that's where primitive reflexes reside. And also, this is your muscle and motor system number 2, and this is you're thinking of your core musculature. And if your child has a super weak core musculature, that means that it's not giving any feedback to the cerebellum at all. Or, I mean, not as much as it should. So if you have a strong motor system and a strong core musculature, that's going to be what's giving a ton of feedback to the cerebellum to also help strengthen that. So not only getting rid of primitive reflexes, but also getting a strong core is what's going to build that cerebellum up, which we ultimately need to do. And this is just a study showing how spinal movements and core musculature actually stimulates the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is responsible for coordinating full body movements, thoughts, feelings, emotions, healthy functioning of the organs, immune system, and these are a lot of things that kids with ADHD struggle with. So increasing the firing rate of that cerebellum is going to be a great thing. And these are some of the examples of core exercises. These are pretty basic ones. Like I said, you can Google different core exercises if you want to, but if your child can't do these positions, like let's say the one when they're lying on their stomach and kind of doing a Superman there, if they can't do that for more than 10 seconds, you're supposed to be able to do it for 30 seconds to a minute. So if they can't do it for that long, that means that their core musculature is not where it needs to be, and it's not feeding into the cerebellum where it needs to be. Or if they're on their back and they're kind of doing that bridge, if they can't hold that position for more than 30 to 60 seconds, or if they're on their side and they can't hold that position for 30 seconds, it's an absolute indicator that that motor system down here is too weak, and they're not getting enough, that motor system's not getting enough feedback to that cerebellum. So we need to make sure that they strengthen up that core. So as weird as it sounds, having a really strong core is going to do wonders for symptomatically for your child that has ADHD or something similar. And then once you build up that sensory motor system, that's what's feeding into the cerebellum and then the brain. So then your cognitive development or your brain development will start to take place. And then, like I said, it'll take place evenly from left to right and not one side getting way stronger than the other. And this is just a picture of your autonomic nerve system. And I always say you can think of this as your automatic nerve system. So this is the things that happen automatically. Your heart's beating. You're not having to consciously tell it to beat, or you're not having to consciously tell your gut to digest the food you just ate, or different things. Like you don't have to tell your body to regulate your temperature at 98.6. These things are just happening automatically. So I mean, that's good, right? You wouldn't want to that'd be a really tedious task if you had to consciously be doing all this. So the thing I like to say is that this autonomic nerve system has two different states. It has a fight or flight state, and it has which is the sympathetic side, and then it has a parasympathetic side, which is more of your development and learning and concentration, resting, healing, digesting, repair. Whereas the fight or flight side, that's more with survival. So if you can kind of think already, where do you think the kids with ADHD are living? And they're absolutely in this survival fight or flight mode, right? They're always on edge. And if you think of a time when you were in a fight or flight state, or you were in a high stress situation, were you able to think properly? Were you able to critically think? Were you behaving properly? Were you kind of fidgety and moving a lot? Think of the last time you were kind of in this fight or flight state and how you were acting. That's how these kids with ADHD, they're constantly in that gas pedal where they're not able to have the proper learning and behavior that they should. So what we're going to want to do is shift them from that fight or flight mode to the more parasympathetic brake pedal, where they develop and learn and concentrate and grow and things like that. So if you're constantly in that fight or flight state, which a lot of these kids are, you're using up a lot of resources and a lot of energy that's basically just wasted, right? They're not actually getting chased by a tiger or a lion. There's no sense in them being in a fight or flight state. But since they are, they're just completely wasting that energy that otherwise could be used for that other parasympathetic side, which, they have better learning, development, things like that. But what do you think would happen if you spent your entire life in the gas pedal, chronic fear-based physiology? Do you think you'd be a little anxious, or do you think you'd have behavior issues? Now that's where these kids have basically been living since day one. So they spent their entire time away from the brake pedal, which is that development side. Would it make sense that they missed some milestones if that happened? The brain might have not have developed the way that it should. That pyramid didn't quite develop like it should. And as if primitive reflexes weren't already causing, enough bad things, unintegrated primitive reflexes will also trigger the fight or flight response, creating chronic stress within the body. So with your cerebellum and brainstem area being so weak, if you still have primitive reflexes, that's kind of the area that also controls fight or flight. So you're going to constantly be in this fight or flight state. When these reflexes remain active, the survival brain is constantly stimulated. You're in this survival mode. There's less ability to assess your prefrontal lobes, where we think and create and communicate and make beneficial decisions. So in other words, we're likely to react instead of controlling our impulses. And that's really describing an ADHD child really well, right? So bringing them out of this fight or flight state is going to be huge. And then also we're going to get really deep into it in a couple slides, is they have these gut issues. But one of the reasons they have these gut issues is because their nerve system's in this fight or flight state. And when it's in that state, you increase there, but then you downregulate all your digestive system and your immune system and things like that. So we unconsciously learn to compensate and suppress these primitive reflexes, which can cause considerable tension and drain of energy. So skills that should be automatic, like reading and writing, they can only be done with continuous effort if your child still has these primitive reflexes. So it's just another reason that we need to make sure that they get rid of those. And then also being able to get them out of this fight or flight state is a huge benefit to these kids. And this is more of just something that's subconscious, right? They don't necessarily think that they're in danger or anything. It's just something that subconsciously this loop is going on where they're stuck in this fight or flight state. And here's another overview. So like I said, we started with the primitive reflexes. That's where they reside in the cerebellum. So if they're still there, it shows that the cerebellum's weak. Also, if they have primitive reflexes, they are almost guaranteed to have a really weak core and not getting enough feedback into that cerebellum, which is just kind of a double whammy. And then the cerebellum is then what grows the prefrontal cortex. So you can see here that the cerebellum is ultimately going to build the higher levels of the brain. So if the cerebellum's weak, which is we covered in 1 and 2, then 3, the development of the brain, higher up is not going to happen. So you can't fully develop one without the other because the motor system is what's going to build that. And then 4, the decider of that brake pedal, or if your body's in that gas or brake pedal, is ultimately in the brainstem, and the medulla oblongata is where the vagus nerve comes out, which is a huge player. And if your child's in the gas or brake pedal. So what is one of the reasons that, I said these kids are often in this fight or flight state from birth, and that's because a lot of times these top 2 bones of the neck, this is where the majority of your subconscious stimulus going to the brain, the top 2 bones here, they're only held in place by like muscles and ligaments. They don't actually have an interlocking joint. So those muscles and ligaments are providing a huge amount of feedback to the brain. So if those bones aren't moving like they should, it sends a huge stress signal to the rest of the brain and body, and it's something called disafferentation. Correct alignment of the head with the rest of the body is necessary for balance. Visual tracking, auditory processing, organized muscle tone, all of which are vital to the ability to focus and pay attention and learn. So just a quick overview of why we kind of focus on those top 2 bones is because they're so important to the nerve system and your neurology. But the birth process, even under optimally controlled conditions, is potentially a traumatic, crippling event for the fetus, and spinal cord and brainstem injury occur often during the process of birth, but frequently escape diagnosis. And the reason for that is because no one's really looking for it, right? So what happens during birth when they might be assisted, they get this kind of biomechanical thing going on with those top 2 bones of the neck, to where when they're helped out, those bones are either misaligned or they're not moving properly. And right there from day 1, they're going to start getting this stress response to the brain and in this fight or flight state, because those top 2 bones aren't working properly, and your brain really requires the biomechanics of that to work properly. So just like a bridge, structure affects function. So when you get these misalignments of the top two bones, you get this thing called disafferentation. Dis meaning like dysfunction, afferentation meaning information going to the brain, decreased brain stem and or brain blood flow. So you can see here the vertebral arteries right here supplying the back of the brain. Those could be affected by a misalignment or the bones not moving properly. Cerebrospinal fluid alterations, mechanical spinal cord tension. And I said, how common is this kind of misalignment to the top two bones? They found that they checked about 1,000 infants and checked them within the first month of life, and 80% were found to have that misalignment, or the upper neck wasn't moving properly, or there's a strain or sprain to it. Another study is looking at CSF and blood flow. So CSF is that cerebrospinal fluid that's providing nutrients to the brain and also taking away toxins. So that and blood flow can be compromised, and almost the CSF gets dammed up and it's not circulating like it should. So when that happens, then that's not going to be good. You need that continuous flow of cerebrospinal fluid for your brain to be able to function properly, as well as getting the proper blood flow to the brain. And both of those things can be compromised with that misalignment to the top two bones of the neck. Here's a study that I thought was particularly interesting, and what they saw was they took a group of adults that had ADHD as kids and then looked at them as adults. So all the people in this study are adults now, but they had ADHD as kids. And what they did is they basically looked at what do they have in common, or is there anything that we can get from this? And they found that 47% had an anxiety disorder, and 38% a mood disorder, 20% an impulse control disorder, and 15% a substance use disorder. And, what this is showing is that a lot of times we think kids outgrow ADHD, but this shows that even though the symptoms of like concentration or sitting still they may have compensated with that, it now shows as anxiety or mood disorder. So the underlying problem is still there. That brain development pyramid is still there. It's just being expressed as something differently as you grow older. So the brain networks and or the cerebellum that's underdeveloped, underregulated, underintegrated in these people, and you don't just outgrow that imbalance without specifically targeting and stimulating the brain networks that need it. So the problems and symptoms may alter and appear to improve as the person learns to compensate in other ways, but the weakness in that system will still remain and cause stress to the system. So just kind of an important point there. They don't necessarily totally outgrow it. You don't outgrow these brain imbalances, or you don't outgrow primitive reflexes without actively trying to get rid of them. So that's why it's important to check that brain development pyramid and make sure that even if you are 50 years old or whatever, and you had ADHD-like symptoms as a kid, this is also something you're going to want to go back through and fill in those gaps of the bottom-up approach. This is going to be where we get really deep into the gut. So the gut is super important in the health of these kids with ADHD. A lot of them, almost every single one that has ADHD is going to have a problem, some type of problem with the GI system, or constipation, or being able to eat certain foods and sensitivities and things like that. So I'll just lay these all out. There we go. So what we see here is between genetic or environmentally induced predispositions, these kids get kind of a wrecked microbiome. And the microbiome's your gut bacteria, and kind of that whole bacterial, there's like, I think 3 pounds of bacteria in your gut. That's good bacteria that you need to be healthy. And what that happens in these kids is that gets depleted. And that can be through things like C-section, which I think Nebraska is actually the highest percentage of C-sections. And the reason that that's important is because if the baby misses out on that natural birth process through the birth canal, it misses that first exposure to the mother's microbiome. So when they do that and then they're taken out surgically, then the first thing they're exposed to is kind of the bad bacteria that you normally think of when you think of bacteria. Also, chronic antibiotic use, the thing with antibiotics is it just wipes out everything, good and bad, and it kind of levels the playing field and allows this bad bacteria to kind of regrow and take control of the microbiome. Inability to breastfeed. Once again, breastfeeding will pass on the microbiome from the mom. Any brain imbalance. And like I said, if your child's chronically in that fight or flight state, then they're going to be up here, and that's going to downregulate the GI system. So that's going to create this thing called leaky gut, and that's basically exactly what it sounds like. Is normally your gut's really tight knit like this, and what happens is it starts getting these holes in it because it's inflamed, and when that happens, then food particles and pathogens and things that aren't supposed to get in the bloodstream start to, and then when that happens, it creates this inflammatory process because you have these things in your blood that's not supposed to be there. And it's just this continuous loop because the leaky gut never gets fixed. So things keep going into the blood, keeps further inflaming the brain or the body. And then once your body has been inflamed and your gut's been inflamed for so long, then eventually it moves on to the brain and you get this leaky brain and it crosses the blood-brain barrier and you get all these toxins in there that aren't supposed to be there. So autoimmune reactions, a lot of these kids have food allergies, food sensitivities, brain inflammation, multiple pathogens. These are things that are contributed because they have a gut that's not healthy. So the digestive issues and learning and behavior issues linked, the microbiome and the health of it is correlated with ADHD. The markers of gut permeability and whether you have leaky gut are elevated in anxiety and ADHD. Increased inflammation is the cornerstone to really any brain issue. So especially ADHD, inflammation is going to play a big part. So if you have this leaky gut, this leaky brain, that's ultimately caused by this excess inflammation. And a lot of the problem is gluten. That's my opinion. Gluten, I think, is bad for everyone. It's just kind of varying levels. I think that everyone has a gluten sensitivity. It's just kind of how sensitive to it are you. But if you already have a gut that's super leaky and already super inflamed, you're not going to handle gluten very well. So a lot of these kids need to be taken, I say always try for 7 days. And if you don't see a huge improvement by taking your child on a gluten-free diet for 7 days, I think that it's just a night and day thing. So there's also a difference between acute and delayed food allergies and sensitivities. A lot of people are like, well, gluten doesn't affect me. That might be like acute. There's an acute food sensitivity, like if you eat a peanut and your throat swells up, and it's like, okay, I'm not going to eat peanuts. But there can be something like where you eat gluten and it's a delayed sensitivity. So, 4 days later, you have a bad day and you're cranky and you're just so mad and you're intolerable to other things. And it's 4 days later, so you don't necessarily tie it back to that gluten that you had 4 days ago. You just contributed to having a bad day or whatever. So that's why it's hard for people to understand that gluten affects everyone. It's just usually in varying quantities. But like I said, it can be a delayed response. So that's why it's even harder to track for people. But the microbiome and the brain are basically inseparable. They're one unit embryologically when you're in the womb, and then they start at the same spot, so they kind of retain this memory for each other. The microbiome has direct communication with the brain, and the gut sends over 400 times more messages to the brain than the brain does to the body. So if you think about that, the microbiome in your gut is sending 400 times more signals to the brain than the brain is to the body. So that's pretty incredible how much of a connection there is with that. And your gut has more neurotransmitters than the brain. Your microbiome is what produces dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, and then it messages it to the brain. So that's pretty crazy if you think about it. I always thought that the brain made those chemicals, but actually the gut plays a big part. So the health of your gut is going to be huge for your child with ADHD. Like I said, it creates all these things. GABA, dopamine's big with the motivation. The best ways to increase dopamine are exercise and healing and sealing that gut. Serotonin, that is heavily correlated with mood. People with low serotonin, they don't get joy from things very easily. And about 90% of the serotonin is made from your gut. So very important that you have a healthy gut and it's not super inflamed and leaky from gluten and getting wrecked with all the other junk food that we're eating. GABA is for calming, inhibiting, calming anxious and racing minds. So what ruins the microbiome is our SAD diet, our standard American diet. We're overfed, we're undernourished, we eat artificial things all the time, we eat gluten, basically all these things just wreck our gut, and then ultimately lead to giving us a leaky brain. And basically, I think of the gut as kind of this gatekeeper to keeping all these toxins out of the brain. So, starting with the nerve system, but then getting that gut under control is going to be a big factor of getting your child long-term success. So how you treat your gut bacteria affects your brain, the rest of the body. Like I said, you have 3 pounds of good bacteria in your gut, or at least you're supposed to. All that inflammation, toxicity in your body, that gut dysfunction, it feeds up to your brain. So like I said, your gut works as that gatekeeper. If you're in that sympathetic fight or flight imbalance, this is going to contribute to leaky gut, chronic inflammation. It's going to upregulate that immune system. You're going to get these food sensitivities from it. The being in that gas pedal compromises your innate immune system, so that increases our adaptive immune system, and that leads to things like autoimmune issues, asthma, eczema, allergies, things like that. If you still have primitive reflexes and you're not regulating control of the gut, you don't have normal gut function. You're not having good blood flow to the gut and proper secretions to the gut. When you're in a fight or flight state, all your blood and energy and resources go to your muscles instead of your internal organs like your gut. So that's another reason why bringing you back on that brake pedal is going to be beneficial. And actually, about 2/3 of your immune system is embedded in your GI tract in your gut. So when you have an inflamed and irritated gut, you're going to have an inflamed and irritated lymphatic and immune system. So, your kid might always be sick or things like that. So gut health is such a big player in getting these kids well. So this is a book done by Norman Doidge. Really good book, Brain That Changes Itself. It's about neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to change. So, it used to be thought that you kind of peaked at 25 for brain potential, and you're kind of born with what you have, and that's what you got, and you just are kind of stuck with whatever cards you've been dealt. And the human brain's actually able to grow new brain cells in the memory center at any age, and it's able to make new connections, rewire. You don't have to settle. You can literally change the brain. The brain can heal itself. It's not unchangeable, and that's neuroplasticity, and that's something that we're starting to understand with our new neuroscience is that, like I said, it used to be thought that you were born with what you have, you can't really do anything about it, but now we're seeing that you can have these huge neurological changes. It's not actual like brain damage and this permanent thing. It's a functional imbalance that can be fixed and changed, and your brain's always trying to heal itself. So it's really an empowering message to these parents or kids that have ADHD, is that you may have been told like you can't really change it. You just kind of have to deal with it, manage it, things like that. And that's absolutely not true. Your brain's constantly changing based on what you're stimulating with. So I think that's a really cool message to kind of explain to parents, and it's a fun little thing to think about. And I think there's a little video here, hopefully. This is Norman Doidge talking about.
Until very recently, our best and brightest scientists and physicians believed that the adult brain couldn't change. Our brain circuits were formed and finalized in childhood. Now we discover that the brain is plastic, meaning changeable. But not all change is good. That changing brain can actually do us harm. Obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and even schizophrenia. But the mind can harness the damaged brain's plasticity to change itself. And now we are finding new treatments for mental diseases and disorders once thought incurable.
When you would tell people, hey, this is your brain sending you a false message, it would help them.
We might actually change the whole course, the whole trajectory of someone's life.
This is medicine. This has outcomes that are medical. It changes brains physically. It changes them chemically. It changes them functionally.
We do not yet see where the limits will be. There are still big new surprises.
My name is Dr. Norman Doidge, and I wrote a book called The Brain That Changes Itself. The discovery of neuroplasticity is the discovery that our brains can change their structure and function through mental experience alone. It signals the most important change in our understanding of the brain in 400 years, because for 400 years, we thought of the brain as though it were like a machine with parts, and that view of the machine-like brain gave rise to a neurological fatalism, because it meant people who were born with brain damage or who sustained brain damage as they developed were condemned to live with it, because machines do many glorious things, but they don't grow new parts, and they can't reorganize themselves.
All right, so that was just a kind of a brief overview of neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to change. And that's really why these kids with ADHD can see such good results. But, you know, what are some indicators of that something went wrong on this pyramid? Because that's ultimately what we've been looking at all night or all day whenever you're watching this. You know, if you're at home, what are some indicators that your child has some gaps in this pyramid? So one is checking for primitive reflexes. That was, you know, pretty obvious. It's going to look at how well your cerebellum's functioning. If your child has retained primitive reflexes and they're older than 4 to 6 months, it's a window in telling them that their cerebellum's weak, and the cerebellum's contributes to all brain functions, especially cognitive behavioral movement. So requires stimulation to that area to get rid of them. There are remediation exercises and all these primitive reflexes on Google, Pinterest, all that good stuff. So if you want to do something at home, the first thing I'd do is check for these primitive reflexes that we went over. And then the second thing you can do is see if your child has a strong core. See if they can do those bridges and those planks and things like that. If your child has a weak core, it's a window in telling you that the cerebellum's not getting enough stimulation. So to further increase cortical, you need more stimulation to increase further cortical brain development to your frontal cortices and things like that. So strengthening the core musculature and motor system will increase the feedback to the cerebellum, which will help the brain development up the pyramid. Anything involving complex movements will build the cerebellum. So think like obstacle courses and rock climbing and throwing things, and anything that involves complex movement is going to be ultimately controlled by the cerebellum. So that's going to give the cerebellum a lot of increased input. So doing any of those things is going to help with your child with ADHD. And then also, you know, if you want to take it a step further, like the things that we do in our office to measure whether the child's in the gas or brake pedal, the first thing that we do is something called HRV, or heart rate variability. You know, this simply put, it measures what gas or brake balance your body's in. So more scientifically, it measures the very small variability of the beat-to-beat interval in your heart, indicating how well your body's constantly adapting. And that shows how well that autonomic nerve system's functioning. So then that's going to show if your body's in more of that sympathetic gas pedal or kind of that parasympathetic brake pedal mode. So, you know, we're faced with a lot of stress. You know, that's not changing to be like, you know, hey, stop being so stressed or stop exposing yourself to so much stress. That's not really practical advice. But what is practical advice is making sure that your body can adapt to stress well. If your body can adapt to stress really well, then that means that you don't get sick as often, or you don't express sickness as often. That's kind of that salutogenic approach of adding health. Adding health means making your body more resilient to stress. And that's kind of what the HRV is looking at. And that's really our goal through care, is making sure that your body can adapt to all the stressors that we're exposed to nowadays. But the HRVs, that's looking at the nucleus ambiguus. It's part of the brain, which is mediates social engagement in the polyvagal system. So non-scientifically, what that means is you're just looking at the part of the nerve system that's controlling the brake pedal, which is now we know super important to getting these kids well. So right here's just another study. The decreased heart rate and increased total power from the HRV analysis indicates a healthy autonomic or automatic nerve system, which is what controls gas and brake pedal. So pretty cool stuff. Also, what we could do is SEMG. This is surface electromyography. What we're doing is looking at the muscles along the spine of your back. And why that's so important is because, you know, if you're in that fight or flight state, all that blood and energy goes more towards your muscles than your internal organs. So if your muscles are working way more than they should, we just know that's wasted energy. You know, it doesn't have to be that way. We would rather have that energy and that blood flow go to your internal organs and help with that brake pedal, rather than just be wasted by going to musculature. The third one is paraspinal infrared thermography. This measures temperature along your neck. If the temperature is more than a half a degree on either side, we know that the nerve system's not working properly. It's in that elevated gas pedal response. So those are kind of three things that are part of our nerve system testing in the office. Those are also indicators of, not hitting all those parts of the pyramid. And then here's some of the graphs from our infrared thermography and just a study explaining why that's important. Common solutions for ADHD, medication is probably the most common. Behavioral modification, ABA, cognitive educational therapy, speech therapy, OT, PT, osteopathic medicine. I'm not acting like, I'm the only one with an answer or anything like that. There are a ton of other different solutions. I'm not personally an expert in any of the ones. I'm an expert in this stuff that I'm giving you tonight, but I just want to let you know that there obviously is other avenues that you can always read more about and learn about and go that way. But like I said, it takes a village. I'm just one person. I'm just an expert in really kind of one area. So I love working with OTs and PTs and MDs and all these different people, because it really does take a village. They're experts in what they do. I'm an expert in what I do. So working together, helps these kids tremendously. Really, our solution would just be following that pyramid of brain development, getting rid of the primitive reflexes, building up that core musculature, bringing balance to the brain if they have a really strong left brain and a weak right brain, balancing that gas and brake pedal to the nerve system, and achieving that top of the pyramid, that desired learning and behavior. So where do you learn? You learn at the brain, right? So wouldn't it make sense to address the components of the brain development pyramid that are affecting your child's ability to learn, focus, behave, and grow? So that's really where our solution lies. Generally, new studies take about 20 to 25 years to be implemented into health practice. So, a lot of this is probably stuff that you've never heard of. It's usually because it's really new science. Like I said, I'm learning every day. I'm constantly looking at new science articles, things like that. So it's just kind of it's kind of a shame that it takes 20, 25 years for new science to finally be kind of integrated into common everyday practice. But, if that's why some of this stuff kind of sounds like, why haven't I ever heard of this? Usually it's because it's really new. New information coming out every day. This is just a diagram made by Paul Hardy. He's a medical doctor that works a lot with like ADHD and autism and those type of things, but he calls this a whole body disorder, and I couldn't agree more. But the thing I like most about this is that he has the nerve system at the pinnacle. So why that's important is because the nerve system controls and coordinates every other system, right? So if the nerve system's not working properly, the GI system can't work properly, detox system can't work properly, immune system can't work properly. So I like that he put the nerve system at the very top, and that's just really driving home that nerve system correction care is what these kids need to be able to get all their other systems working properly. This is kind of the game plan, if you will, kind of that roadmap of what I would do with these kids to get better. Number one starts with that information system, or that nerve system, making sure that is working properly, because if your nerve system is controlling and coordinating everything and that's not working properly, then that's already going to put you off on a bad foundation. So making sure that works properly is number one. Number two is taking out the wrong foods, putting in the right foods, decreasing that inflammation in that leaky gut, increasing brain support, eating the right foods, heal, seal that gut, decrease inflammation by decreasing the gluten intake. Like I said, try for 7 days to go gluten-free. And if you don't see a huge change in your child, I would be floored. So the brain and gut is on fire. It causes all kinds of learning and behavior difficulties. 60% of your brain is omega-3 fat. So low-fat diets are not good for the brain. So don't do those. I'd recommend taking high-quality fish oil. So having a diet high in good fats is going to be really good for these kids too, because that's going to provide the nutrition for the brain that they need. Then we move on to 3, that's kind of the healing and sealing of the gut. 4, repairing the body. 5, excreting all those detox detoxing that whole body, and the way that can happen is, remember, number 1, getting that nerve system working properly. And then 6 is that movement, behavior, create new patterns, making sure that your child's moving. Like I said, that's what's going to be feeding the brain is movement. So exercise, vary their hearts. A lot of these kids just sit all day and they get no variability in their heart at all. It just is constantly just at, this set point. Like, have them go for a run and really elevate it and then bring it down. That's really good for their bodies. The best thing you can do for your child for ADHD is let them be bored. They don't constantly have to be on a screen. You don't constantly have to be like, their entertainer. Let them be bored. That forces them to be creative and use their right brain and things like that. That'll be great for them. You must have consequences for kids that are left brain dominant, which is ADHD. If they're not compliant, one of the worst things for kids is that are struggling with ADHD or behavior issue or something like that is inconsistent parenting. Making sure that you're both on the same page with consequences, and making sure you have hard consequences, because these kids are going to push to find a boundary, and if they never find a boundary, they're just going to keep pushing. So making sure to set a hard boundary and having consequences is going to be really good for helping them develop further. And sleep is important, so making sure that your kid gets to sleep. I think you guys probably already know this, but no screens before bedtime. But also, if they are on the screen and they have like a new Apple product, they actually have a new feature. It's called what's it called? I can't remember. Apple came out with this new feature that actually lets you take away blue light from the screen. So it's a really warm looking screen. And then that will help not keep you up so late. It won't stimulate your brain thinking that it's daytime by looking at all this blue light. But many times people say, is there just one thing that I can do to improve my child's condition? And then I kind of explain that, if you're sitting on 4 tacks and you take away one of them, now you're only sitting on 3 tacks. Did that problem get 25% better? And the answer is no, right? You're still sitting on 3 tacks and it still hurts probably about the same amount. So you need to remove all of them. This is why, going through this full roadmap and taking a big picture view and building up that pyramid of brain development and making sure you heal and seal that gut, getting rid of primitive reflexes, and doing all these different things is what, your child needs, not just, doing one thing, because they're still sitting on 3 different tacks. So you need to remove all these different tacks to be able to really get like a good long-term solution. So the primary condition is kind of that brain development pyramid. It creates these different secondary conditions. This was an ADHD topic, but also that brain development pyramid contributes contributes to all these different secondary conditions. So these are a lot of the different secondary conditions we see with kids in the office, but also these are more of our adult secondary conditions, because we do see adults as well. So that brain development pyramid, it can apply to anyone, whether they're 1 year old and coming to the office, or they're, 62 years old. I'll usually do the same thing and look at that brain development pyramid, see if it's a developmental problem in nature, and then go from there, because it helps with all these different things when you add health to that nerve system and make sure that it's working optimally. So what does a session look like if you were interested? What's kind of my next step? What's that roadmap? Really, what I always start with is just like a free consultation in our office and discuss your child's case or your own case, and then figure out if we're a good fit. You'll listen to me, you'll say, that sounds good or not, and then we'll go from there. And if it sounds good and everyone's good on both ends, we'll perform that initial nerve system testing and exam. We'll look for primitive reflexes. We'll look at the core stability. We'll get rid of those primitive reflexes, build up the core, bring balance to the brain, balance that gas and brake pedal, and then finally achieve that desired learning and behavior. So that's kind of what the next step would be, but I always start with just a free consultation in the office and making sure that we're a good fit for each other and everything sounds right. But that's really kind of the end of what I have. Usually I kind of begin by asking, how long your child has had this issue with ADHD and kind of what else have you tried? And depending on what you tried, has it been a top-down approach? Does it seem like it's more of a top-down thing, or has anyone ever took them from bottom up in that brain development pyramid? So it's you always want to take that bottom-up approach. And simply a top-down approach often fails when looking at the brain development pyramid. So that's kind of what I have for you. I'm always here as a resource. I always want to be kind of a trusted advisor for you, no matter what your health condition or issue is. I would love to just talk with you. So if you ever have a question, feel free to email me, call our office. We're out in Elkhorn on 204th and Dodge. Like I said, I'm always an open resource for you and your health questions. My job is to find a solution for you. So if I can't help you, I will find someone that will. I hope that this webinar helped you out. I hope that you took some nuggets from it that you can start implementing tomorrow and helping your child, whether it's the diet or getting a quality fish oil or doing core exercises or checking if they have primitive reflexes, things like that. So with that, guys, have a good day or night, and like our Facebook page on Restore Chiropractic Elkhorn, and I will see you guys later. Thanks for tuning in tonight.